As the pioneers moved westward across America, they built schools for their children wherever they settled. These first schools were often constructed of whatever material was available. Sod schoolhouses were common in the prairie states, and log buildings were constructed as schools in the northern states, like Wisconsin and Minnesota. Here is a miner's claim shack, which was used as a school building about 1904 in South Dakota. These first crude schoolhouses were usually replaced later with a more dignified wood frame school building. This is an early wood frame schoolhouse which was built about 1860 in the town of Maine in Marathon County. By the late 1800s, the one-room schoolhouse was being built more elaborately as farmers in rural school districts began to prosper. By the 1880s and 90s, one-room schools were being built with elaborate bell towers and fancy shutters and wooden trim. Contrary to popular belief, most one-room schoolhouses were painted white, not red. By the turn of the century, many one-room schoolhouses were being constructed of brick or stone. Many of these old brick school buildings still stand in isolated rural areas today. Most are abandoned, while some are being used as town halls or even homes. A typical day in a rural one-room school started at 8 a.m. and ended at 4 p.m. The teacher arrived at school early to fire up the stove, fetch the drinking water, and finish preparing the lessons. At 8, the teacher rang the bell, either a handbell or the one in the bell tower, to signal the beginning of the school day. The flag was then raised and the Pledge of Allegiance was said. Everyone was expected to be on time. Tardy students were punished or given extra chores, like cleaning the outhouse at recess. Then the students formed 2 lines outside the school building. One was for the girls, one for the boys. If there was only one front door, the girls would enter first and wait by their desks as the boys entered. Some schools, like this one, were built with 2 doors in front, one for the girls, one for the boys. This allowed the 2 groups to enter together. Here's another picture of a different schoolhouse with the double doors. A one-room school was a heavy responsibility for one teacher, who may have had as many as 40 children in 8 different grades at one time. Students attended the one-room school until they had successfully completed the 8th grade. For many, this took more than 8 years. Some of the students could not attend class the entire school year because of farm work or great distance. A student usually did not go on to high school after he had completed the 8th grade. Students often walked miles to attend a country school. It was common for the boys to go to school only during the winter months, because during the fall and spring they were needed to help harvest or plant. Often during warm months, children came to school barefoot. The first public school transportation was not available until after 1900. Early school buses were horse-drawn affairs, and the going was slow, as frequent stops had to be made. Many rural schools did not have electricity until the 1940s. Note the electric fixtures in this school from 1910. Kerosene lamps were also used for lighting. Typical fixtures in a one-room school included the wood or coal stove, an American flag, blackboards, framed prints of George Washington, maps of the United States, and the wood and cast iron school desk. The teacher's voice could not carry beyond the single classroom, and disciplining 8 different grade levels was difficult. So there was no practical reason to add extra rooms or dividing walls onto the one-room schoolhouse. No time was wasted in getting to work. The teacher explained the assignments, making sure students had textbooks, slates, and slate pencils. The students were divided into groups according to the level they were at. The groups alternated their tasks. The younger students were first called to the front to verbally recite their lessons while the older students worked on other assignments. Recitation, memorization, copying, and reading went on all at the same time. Reading, grammar, and spelling were the most important lessons in the country school curriculum. The standard text was often the McGuffey's Reader. These 19th century readers are fascinating because of their content and unique illustrations. Through them, farm children received a classical and very moral education. The readers strongly taught the meaning of right and wrong, good and evil. Paper was expensive, so 19th century school children wrote on lap slates with slate pencils. Slates are easily cleaned with the sleeve or of one's shirt or with a little bit of spit. Paper tablets, crayons, and paints did not become common in one-room schools until after 1900. They were usually too expensive for most rural school districts to afford. Writing and penmanship were an important part of the day's work, and usually the only time during which students were allowed to use paper. Children were taught to use pen and India ink. The penmanship style of the 19th century required a great deal of practice. Letters were fancy, with many flourishes and filigrees. Spelling bees were usually held on Friday, with the teacher using all the new words learned that week. Winners were often rewarded with special certificates of merit, such as this one. These fancy awards were usually hung for a time in a place of honor at home. Report cards were graded on a scale of 100, with 90 to 100 being an A, 80 to 90 a B, 70 to 80 a C. Anything below 70 was failing. If a student passed all his subjects with adequate grades, he was promoted to the next level. Recess was an important activity at a one-room school. After being cooped up for so long in one room, children were given mid-morning breaks. One popular game at recess with the younger children was Drop the Handkerchief, a turn-of-the-century version of Duck, Duck, Goose. One-room schools rarely had indoor plumbing. Drinking water was brought in by the pail. Bathroom facilities were the standard outhouse. Sometimes 2 outhouses were built, one for the girls and one for the boys. Rural schools were not well funded until after 1900. Parents often paid for the schoolhouse, usually building it themselves. Parents also paid teacher salaries and bought many of the books. Here is a letter showing state funding for Marathon County rural schools in 1870. Notice that the average amount of funding from the state was only about $70 a township for one whole year. Funds were allocated based on the number of reported school children in the township. This is a letter from the Marathon County School Superintendent, John Lamont, dated 1904, permitting an area school teacher to allow children to take home school books overnight. Prior to 1900, most rural schools did not even have enough money so that each child could have their own book. Books often had to be shared. This is a Marathon County Teaching Certificate, good for the 3rd level. Not meaning grade level, but level of subject matter. Notice this teacher was not certified to teach geometry or philosophy. Certification in these areas would have moved her up to the 4th level of teaching. To get a teaching certificate, you had to be a graduate of the 8th grade. Then you took a written test at the county seat. If you passed, you were certified, but your certification had to be renewed every year or two by passing another written exam. Notice that this teacher was only 18. Some school teachers were even as young as 16. One-room school courses were often taught without any suggested curriculum until after the turn of the centuries. Teachers were expected to know their subject matter well. They were not expected to know how to teach correctly. After 1900, state manuals like this one were sent to rural teachers in order to encourage more refined teaching methods. Discipline was also changing. Teachers were instructed not to spank or slap children with rulers anymore. This manual suggested more modern discipline techniques, like having the child stand in a corner or putting an older boy between a group of younger girls. Rules for Teachers, 1872. Teachers were expected to refill water buckets and coal shuttles. They were also in charge of cleaning the school building. Teachers were expected to maintain high moral standards in the community. Their dating habits and church attendance were carefully watched. And once a female teacher married, she was often dismissed. Wages for teachers were low, especially for women teachers. Male teachers were always paid more. This teacher's contract for 1907 shows that Edith Rice, a rural Marathon County teacher, was paid $304 to teach school that year. And to top it off, it was required in her contract that she keep the rooms warm. Most rural school districts were consolidated in the 1960s. After this, rural children were bused to larger schools in towns and cities. As a result, most one-room schoolhouses were closed by the late 1960s. However, about 835 one-room schools still exist in America today. Most are in the western United States, Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana. Here are modern children attending a one-room school in Idaho. Notice the varied ages of the children. Many old one-room schools have been torn down or remodeled into dwellings. However, a few have been restored as museums. This restored Little Red Schoolhouse is in Marathon Park, and it is open to the public during the Fair Week each summer by the Altrusa Club. Inside, desks, blackboards, old maps, antique water coolers recreate an accurate turn-of-the-century classroom. I encourage all of you to visit the schoolhouse next summer when it is open and think about what it would be like to attend classes in a one-room school.